Alrighty, we have a bunch of people joined. It's 9:01 Pacific, 1:01 here in Japan. So let's begin to get ready for what we're going to do today. So I'm going to focus today on the online self-certification questionnaire. And let me give you a little background about what's happening here and why. So I was talking with the various OpenChain governing board members recently. We are prepping for the ISO release in late September. And one of the main parts of feedback was that, first of all, people would like an executive overview of the self-certification for corporate executives, about 2 or 3 minutes, because increasingly they're dealing with that conversation with suppliers. The second thing that came up was that people want a 30 to 60-minute walkthrough of the self-certification questionnaire. And this is related to the fact that it's taking many companies a while to self-certify, and many people are overshooting. They're working as hard as possible to build the most robust processes possible for their first conformance and their first program conformant. When, of course, you can have a much lighter program for initial conformance and gradually improve over time. So what we want to do is to have an example walkthrough of the self-certification questionnaire, and there'll be a formal video for OpenChain doing that. But today we're going to begin that process with the first walkthrough, and I would deeply appreciate your comments, feedbacks, and criticisms, particularly around suggestions of how to complete aspects of it. Now, the mental model I'm bringing to the table today is I'm going to talk about this as if I was speaking to a company which really doesn't have a great deal of OSPO in place. Its open source program office is minimal, if at all. And I'm not expecting a great deal of in-depth open source knowledge either. So basically, I'm thinking about the average company out there as opposed to our usual partner companies. Now, as I go through, this will take about, 20, 30 minutes. As I go through, please feel free to stop me at any time. And as I conclude, we're going to talk through a little bit about what we think of the questionnaire and what's problematic or not, so that we can get everything nice and neat for the ISO situation, where we're going to be dealing with thousands of new companies hearing about OpenChain for the first time. All right, to kick off, our self-certification questionnaire is, of course, available online. The link is certification.openchainproject.org. This self-certification questionnaire is available for every version of the OpenChain standard. This is a purposeful decision because, let me give you an example. Hitachi is currently OpenChain 1.2 conformant. So they may be asking their supply chain to conform to that particular version of the standard. And to do so, we want to make sure that they can link to it. There we go, version 1.2. Now, today's walkthrough will be of the latest version 2.0, because that's what most people are seeing for the first time. 2.0 is, of course, built on our spec. The spec is roughly split into 6 sections. We refer to them as the goals. And this particular setup with OpenChain 2.0 is really about adding goal 6, which is about making sure people have documented everything and they review their OpenChain conformance every 18 months. But let's start at the beginning. Know your open source responsibilities. This is 13 questions, and I feel that's a lot of questions, but it's a big question. You know, this is a big field. So first of all, documented policy that governs open source license compliance of supplied software. We have very strong open source policy material, primarily thanks to Andrew Katz and his team, who built the OpenChain policy template, which allows people to put together a policy that covers a lot of the bases. The suggestions here, talking about does your policy cover training, internal wiki, other practical communication, and so on, that's related to earlier discussions on OpenChain, and it may not reflect our current reality. You know, for instance, now we basically tell people go look at the reference policy templates. as opposed to playing jazz with it and saying, do you have a wiki or something that covers these topics? So maybe that's something that we might cut out and edit. It's not necessarily additive to the thing. And maybe referencing our reference material may be more useful. Do you have a documented procedure that communicates the existence of the open source policy to all software staff? This is something that comes up quite frequently. And a lot of people tend to go towards, do we need an online service to do so? And if so, what type of online service, and so on and so forth. Of course, the procedure could be as simple as sending an email to the software staff or the relevant people, in which case we don't need to have something as heavy as an online portal. This is probably a failing point for many companies where they're confused about how to fill this out. And as with everything in OpenChain, we're non-prescriptive. You can, of course, have an online portal to communicate the existence of the open source policy, or you can communicate directly via other means. We probably need to make sure that's very clear. Next one, all about identifying roles and responsibilities for the effectiveness of the open source program. This is a very simple question. I've never encountered a company having a particular problem in filling this out, except that many companies don't actually have identified roles or applied responsibilities which cover the whole scope of open source compliance. But that's something that companies need to work through, and that's fine.
Shane, I have a question there on that one.
Yeah.
So is OpenChain defining roles or levels of roles that need to be, filled within the organization?
That's a really good question. So OpenChain is not prescriptive about the roles. So companies can determine their own roles that are regarded as important. And I'll give an example here. So some companies actually have very few people on open source compliance. It may be because the company is small, or it may simply be because that's how the company does it. So they may have very few roles, let's say primary open source lead, and then a lawyer who is assigned to answer the open source questions. And then of course we have the more sophisticated companies with a full OSPO that mixes engineering, project management, and legal. So it's really up to the companies. We don't define that. This is purposeful because we want to be applicable to companies of all sizes in all markets. But to your question, we may need to up our game on making sure that people realize they can fully define the roles there.
Okay. I did find a spreadsheet, and it defines roles starting with an open source compliance board member. So, and then going all the way down. So yeah, those are just suggestions. It's not a definition. Okay.
That's right. So over on GitHub, the OpenChain project has a repository of approximately, I think it was over 400 objects last time I checked. And this is where the reference material is housed. But it is important that the reference material is not regarded as prescriptive. We do try to have several reference items, but we don't have that everywhere. And we probably need to think about ways of making it clearer that people don't need to worry about looking at something in our reference material, which could come from a very sophisticated, very large, very well-funded company, and thinking, I simply can't do this. Yeah.
Okay.
Great question. I mean, coming straight off that, have you identified and documented the competencies required for each role? This is something where I believe some of our reference material touches on. And I think, if people get over the hurdle of understanding they define the role, documenting the competencies should be something they can follow directly from. One thing that comes straight to mind is, do we need to embed more references to the reference material throughout this to help people out? That might be something that we could do in the future, a little click, see examples or similar.
I think that would be really helpful.
Next one, documented evidence of assessed competence for each program participant. So knowing where the people are at. And this is probably something where you need to make sure that people know what's up. The policy is one thing. That's something that was covered in an earlier question, but the open source objectives, the contributions expected, and the implications of failing to meet that. The point here is probably to make sure that engineers and project managers know precisely when they should be getting open source code and how, and if they take a different path, why that may actually damage the product launch or service provision. This isn't super relevant for companies who are used to this, but it is super relevant for companies in places like Asia who have engineering staff that may not know the licenses and, for instance, may copy open source code into a driver which is provided as a proprietary driver, which is not a good idea. Process for determining the scope of the program. This is one of those open-ended questions where people can put a lot of effort in. Honestly, it's really up to how the company wants to answer it. I mean, the process could be super simple. It could be this applies to all our code, and this is how we manage it. Or it could be much more nuanced. Let me pick an example here. A company like Hitachi, where they're applying it to certain aspects of the business, particularly in areas like automotive. I don't think the question's a problem. What might be interesting is to make sure that people know that they have control over the process content. We stress this throughout the project, but it does keep coming up. We're defining inflection points, not content, but it does keep coming up and people say, what is a good enough process? And the answer is, yeah, it depends. But that is a genuine question we got to deal with. A written statement that clearly defines the scope and limits of the program. This is based purely on the fact of learned experience where people tend not to document this material, so people don't know where their barriers are. I don't think that this question should pose difficulty to any company because it's pretty clear that they can determine the scope here. There's nothing we're being prescriptive about. Process for reviewing open source license, obligations, restrictions, and rights. Again, this is a very self-explanatory question, and it's clear that there's nothing either prescriptive, expected, or that may be prescriptive in what they should follow. So for instance, people can decide to follow the license lists of OSI and then look at something like the FSF GPL FAQ to understand what they're doing. And that's totally fine. Or they may decide to take a slightly different route with regards to determining what the open source license right and obligations are. Document a procedure to review and document the obligations, rights, and restrictions. This is something that a lot of companies are missing. They tend to simply expect that the engineering teams will report new licenses and legal will review them. This is probably something that companies often are missing, but again, it's something self-explanatory. There's nothing too heavyweight there. So in a nutshell, knowing your responsibilities has a couple of open-ended questions where people may not be sure what's the appropriate process or policy complexity here, or as was brought up, the roles. We may need to tighten that up a little so people don't get lost. Okay, let's talk about.
Sorry, Shane, it's Sammy.
Yeah, hi, Sammy.
On the last question, I think one of the things that we need to highlight to people is that there is the playbook that was released by Finos a couple of years ago. Yes. I think Ghislaine worked on that. I think that's a good starting point. Obviously, there's a sort of an element of legal interpretation as to what company might regard as the obligations and interpretation of licenses, but there's nothing stopping people taking that playbook and using that as the basis of forming their own documented review process and pointing people to the internal version of that document.
That's a great point. Do you have a link handy on that one? I don't have one.
I would need to look at it. We have our own version that we were maintaining before that. So, but I can dig that out and put it in the chat.
That would be super, Sammy. Thank you. And a great point about the utility there. So, you know, I mean, as mentioned earlier with Mary's note and my reply to it, we do have a lot of material in the reference library. And one of the activities that will be done ahead of the ISO release is trying to tie a lot more of this material directly onto the website. So right now, and I'm just going to open this up, we have a resources page for OpenChain, and that kicks off with the case studies. It goes into the training slides because that's the most requested thing. And then a leaflet designed to educate suppliers in open source. So this is something that was created by the Japanese companies directly to deal with their suppliers across Asia. It's translated into simplified traditional Chinese, Korean, and I think it's being translated into a few more languages right now. That's been very popular as well. And then we have a few things like infographic, one page or one slide about OpenChain. Before moving into some other case studies, and then OpenChain and M&A, because that has come up a lot. Below that, we've got a summary of some other resources, and then we link to GitHub. But I mean, long and short, with over 400 documents in GitHub, we probably need to remap that page to link to more documentation and make discovery easier. Okay, back to the questionnaire. Responsibility for achieving compliance. So assigning the individuals responsible for external open source compliance inquiries, a number of ways to do this. For instance, have someone on your open source page, or for instance, add yourself to the Linux Foundation open source compliance directory. But long and short, make sure someone is there to get the requests. One thing we discovered is that a lot of companies didn't have someone for external contacts, and that led to escalation of community-based enforcement actions because people couldn't find someone to talk to. So it's a significant step forward if they can, and that's why it's there. So the open source liaison function, publicly identified, that's really what we mentioned above. You make someone responsible and then you publicly identify them. That's no problem for most companies. Recently, a lot of people have been coming to me and saying they want to be added to the open compliance directory. So it seems companies are preferring to centralize that, but it's, you know, it's a la carte, whatever they want. Alrighty, I mean, this is directly connected. Do you have a document of procedure that assigns responsibility for receiving and responding to compliance inquiries? So, you know, identify the person, publicly identify them, and then make sure their responsibilities are clearly carved out. This is a process failing point that happens in a lot of companies where, for example, it's not totally clear who's responsible for the different activities. So someone might get the incoming and then forward it to legal and expect legal to deal with it, but legal kind of thinks they should be dealing with it. And this is where we have a process failing often. It's a very simple thing. Have you documented the person's group or function supporting the program roles identified? So this is really about sustainability. This is about making sure that when someone moves on, there is someone who knows that they need to backfill that. So quite often this would be OSPO. So the OSPO is responsible for making sure that there is actually an external open source liaison always on point. This is based on learned experience, where even if people have someone responsible, they have the role defined, someone moves on and the role is kind of lost. That's actually happened to a surprising number of companies. And this is related to that, making sure that the roles are staffed and funded. This is something where sometimes companies actually shut down their entire OSPO, make it a volunteer thing, which exposes them to a lot on the compliance front. Okay, so legal expertise identified. This is to prevent the process failing where there might be an OSPO, or at least people who are charged and defined on open source, but legal as a whole doesn't have a contact person. So you forward it to legal and it bounces around. In one instance, which was highly amusing, a very large corporation had their trademark lawyer dealing with open source license compliance because that was the only person that opened that email address. Well, not exactly great. Do you have a documented procedure assigning internal responsibilities. And this is, I think, where we would say the remediation challenge. It has taken quite frequently 3 months or more to deal with the supply chain hops and identifying a process failure. You know, which supplier made a mess this time? And someone needs to be responsible for staying on that. This is where we often find things disappear into a black hole. On some occasions, companies need to be contacted multiple times by parties to get something done because the company reached out to the suppliers and it just went dead and someone wasn't tracking it. And again, this is really about making sure that companies don't face escalation, especially from annoying community members who want to make sure their code licenses are being followed. So this is about pulling it together, document a procedure for handling review and remediation of non-compliant cases. So again, we're looking at make sure someone's assigned and then have the procedure for them on how to deal with this. Again, it's open-ended. We have questions about how complex that should be. And the answer probably is as simple as long as you are responsible and you know what's happening, if you're talking to external or internal to get this remediated, just come back to it every 2 weeks, have that process there until it's resolved. Alrighty. All of those are pretty self-evident. Any questions or comments on these? If not, on we go to review of open source content.
Sorry,
Okay.
Shane,
Yeah.
it's me again.
Hey, Sammy.
The Linux Foundation compliance directory, it doesn't actually list the list of companies and contact details.
Yes. Well, there are 2 things happening. They're updating it this week, but second of all, they do not plan to have compliance names on this. So what will happen is that people will ask the Linux Foundation and they'll be put in contact with the relevant department. Partly, this is because internally, Linux Foundation has Salesforce integration of all member companies and tracks who's going where. And that's to make sure the directory is fresh, that we know who to contact in the company. And partly, of course, it's to avoid having lots of individual names up there, which can lead to certain questions in various geographies.
Okay, and do you know whether in the contact details that could be an email alias?
Yeah, it can indeed. Many companies do so. So for example, open source at philips.com is their open source contact, and that happens to go to the assigned lawyer. But again, it's important. So if people move on, people can stay in contact with the department. My recommendation is always use a generic address because staff rotate too quickly nowadays.
No, and I know we use an email alias on our external website, and I'm pretty certain that we added the same email address to the directory, but I need to double check that.
Yeah.
Having a contact point on your external email on your external website seems a good backup for perhaps folks who are in a hurry. I don't know what the throughput is on the Linux Foundation handling of queries, but nobody making a query really loves delay.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I
mean, that's what we did. We have it on our open source on our website where we refer to our open source policy and sort of how we manage software.
And I mean, Jim, you've kind of hit the nail on the head. The number one escalation we found in community enforcement is non-responsiveness or being too slow. So that's probably the most vital step. Get that line of communication open. It's a different matter if it's corporate question. There's a little bit more flexibility there. And 80% plus of code in major projects is corporate now, but certainly quicker is better than slower. I just opened the page that Sammy put the link in for the FINOS Open Source License Compliance Handbook. So that might be something useful for companies. I'll make sure that we cover that in the OpenChain project. At the moment, it's in the Zoom chat, so you can look at that link at your own, what do you call it? Well, on your own prerogative and time.
And
Okay,
Shane,
Hi,
this is
Jeff.
Jeff here. Look at the Open Compliance Program page on the Linux Foundation, and you know, as you said, it's a kind of you know, you request for some data. I wonder if we could put on that main page, you know, common email addresses are in the form of, you know, open source at company name. You know, so people can make the request, but they can also try kind of an industry standard.
That's a great idea. I like it. It's so simple, and it could help them. Yeah. You know what? I'm gonna have a chat with everyone across the Open Compliance team and get that added. I guess, I mean, for generic addresses, open source at or compliance at would be the two main addresses we find out there. All righty, next part of the questionnaire. Review and approve open source content. This is probably one of the largest compliance failings in the world, where inadequate review hits us. Okay, so documented procedure for identifying, tracking, and archiving information about the collection of open source components. In essence, the main solution here is have a software bill of materials, and there are existing standards like SPDX that solve for this. One thing that confuses people is sometimes people think that they can only use something like SPDX with automation, and of course that's not true. You can use SPDX as human readable for manual processes as well. Obviously automation is preferred, but many people have manual, and that's fine. The documented procedure for identifying, tracking, and archiving information, people sometimes ask how in-depth that procedure should be, and the answer is really just use a standard SBOM. Do you have open source component records, which indicate the documented procedure was followed? This one is an interesting one. A few people have stumbled on that, and the answer is just make sure you know when you did the scan and where the output of the scan is. It doesn't have to be too in-depth at all. Implemented a procedure that handles at least the following common open source license use cases. So distribution in binary, source, integration with something else that may trigger copyleft, if applicable, modified open source or other software with an incompatible license, or contains open source with attribution. So, you know, the vast majority of code nowadays is probably distributed in binary, has attribution requirements, and, you know, contains modified open source. The main failing point we see with something like a permissive license like BSD is probably that people take the code and they no longer recognize it as actually being under the obligations of BSD. So they might, as I said, include it in a driver, and they may forget the attribution, which is about basically the only way you can break the BSD license. The other items are a little bit more biased towards copyleft, whether weak or strong. The reason for that is because it's probably around copyleft licenses that we see the majority of open source license problems. It's certainly the area where we see the majority of community enforcement action. All of these appear self-evident. It doesn't look like there's a major problem in asking someone to have a procedure that deals with these items. I just wanted to pause here and see if anyone had any comment or concern about that approach. Alrighty, now,
so,
sorry, go ahead.
This is Jeff here. I'm just looking, you know, I think that, you know, often, you know, distribution is the big concern that many people have. You know, with all the heat and light around software as a service, I just want to see, do we have that explicitly called out as a bullet point here, that, you know, it's distributed with all these items, but, you know, as a service, it may also have open source obligations as well. And I don't know if we explicitly called that out here.
We don't explicitly call it out here or in the current version of the spec, And it's a good point that we might want to triage that.
So I think it was around the integrated with other open source source such that it may trigger copyleft obligations. So you might be using with open source or proprietary software, and depending on the license, you may have those obligations triggered. So I think that's what that one was trying to address.
Maybe if we put at the question a parenthesis, in distributed or hosted form, or so that these questions pertain to whether it's distributed or hosted, or so that it's not just so distributed context. Such a distributed.
I mean, Jim, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a fairly major change to consider hosted and distributed as a different animal. And I don't mean that I necessarily disagree with you, because if you've put it out, you've put it out. And the notion of a chain is, what am I, what have you involved me in? Please tell me this chain of software that I have, that I've now, either benefited from or entangled myself with.
So I think you have to remember that you will have what I referred to in the playbook, for example, that specifies what the obligations, and there is a lot of interpretation in terms of is this distribution or not, whether it is subject to a straightforward copyleft license, or whether there is an element of distribution. And again, that's why this combined with the requirement to have a clear process of defining what the obligations are. Obviously, if you're in your organization, you consider hosting some form of GPL code in a service environment, that is distribution. Another organization might consider that actually isn't distribution. So again, you need to, there's an element of legal interpretation of the license in combination with the use case.
This is Andrew here. Sorry. So my recollection is that there is an open issue on this for discussion during for the next release. So the question is whether SAS should be explicitly covered as being a potential form of distribution.
So just to add to the conversation, I'm increasingly running into software as a service, and there are some open source licenses that do have obligations just for deploying the code, not necessarily distributing. So I think it's an important issue to take up in this forum. The other, and maybe not for this release, but for the subsequent releases, I would encourage us to take that as a high priority, since I'm seeing it more and more. The other thing, just to introduce, I've used the term deploy to distinguish taking software and making it available as a public service on a hosted server. So I don't know if you want to adopt the term deploy within the OpenChain community or pick a different term, but having a term that actually defines, to be able to distinguish between taking software and making that available over the public internet versus just using it internally, for example, as a development tool. That's an important distinction.
I guess no matter how we word it, we have to be really clear that we're not, and this is not directly to your point, Jim, but it's kind of adjacent to it. We're not attempting to expand the scope of open source. We're just trying to make sure that any applicable license, you'll get aware of it. And something like the Affero GPL, which will trigger over SAS, is rare, but I guess we may need to put some kind of reference point that people should be aware that these kind of things can happen. Just a side note on SAS and related items, several companies in the OpenChain community are utilizing open source and not distributing it, and they're not using Affero, but they're using OpenChain for internal clarity. And I think this feeds indirectly into also M&A, where companies are making sure they've got a clean slate, and whether they're purchasing or selling, they know that the open source is triaged. So even if it's BSD or GPL and their SAS, they know that their processes are solid. That was just a side note.
Yeah, I mean,
So Shane,
I still want to, sorry.
Shane, this is Samantha from Cisco.
Hey.
So when we went through the conformance on this, I did not differentiate between embedded and SAS. So anything that's within our code for binary, source, or trigger copyleft obligations. However, from a legal perspective, my automated workflow had to take into consideration, we'll just say the AGPL, and we put warning signs up on our automated SAS models based upon the go-to-market models to ensure that if it did trigger that, they did take the additional copyleft obligations, and we did have a legal review of the open source. So those items, when we went through conformance, were bolted together, but for the solution to ensure that my engineers across the corporation followed and complied with this consistently, we had to build unique workflows based upon these obligations. So that's just from our working experience with the model that we just deployed this last year.
And we had a similar approach, Samantha. And again, I think sort of within ARM, we have about 28 different use cases. I think to be fair, when we originally sort of put this list, we said at the minimum you should have considered these items. So, and that is clear from the question that you have implemented a procedure that that handles at least the following common open source cases. It doesn't mean that you can't go beyond that. Certainly, in our case, we have 27, 28 use cases that engineers can select to, which would trigger different obligations depending on the license.
I suppose one thing that's interesting about more sophisticated companies is that they're very well aware that they've got multiple use cases. And a lot of companies aren't really aware of how they triage this at all. So OpenChain is trying to set the floor for them and then let them iterate out. This is where we have the Kaizen, the continual improvement that Toyota pioneered.
Yeah, sorry, Shane. Just last comment. I would still sort of would recommend that people look at the playbook, because again, that is trying to combine both the use case and the license, and sort of makes it clear sort of what the different obligations might be as a result.
And just looking at it, the actual handbook is on GitHub as well, which is nice. Which, let's just have a look and see what, it's Apache license or Creative Commons 4.0. Share alike? Yeah, Creative Commons Attribution Share alike 4.0, which makes it pretty easy for people to remix it. Just as a side note, OpenChain's reference library, the whole thing, that's all CC0, public domain. So we couldn't include the handbook directly in our library, but we could certainly reference out to it. And to Sammy's point, it sounds like it might help contextualize these things. Okie dokie. I think that's all for goal 3. Let's move on to goal 4. Pretty short here with the questions. Delivering the compliance artifacts. And this is vitally important, but we're able to capture that quite quickly. So document a procedure that describes the process that ensures the right compliance artifacts are distributed with the supplied software as required by the licenses. This is simply because a lot of companies don't actually have a documented procedure for making sure this happens, and therefore things go horribly wrong. Archiving copies of the compliance artifacts. This is an interesting one where companies may distribute the stuff okay, but then not actually have the compliance artifacts for later. They might not keep them on their backups, which has led to situations where a customer company, which didn't need the source code at one point, comes back 5 years later and their supplier does not have the compliance artifacts archived, which is clearly not good. Are copies of the compliance archived for at least as long as the software is offered or required by the identified licenses, whichever is longer. So this is getting much more explicit about trying to ensure that the whole life cycle of the product is covered. This, unless the identified license requires a very lengthy period, this does not deal with the product is gone, end of life, and no longer supported. But in normal commercial approach, that's well understood. So the delivery is critical. Making sure you can continue to deliver the compliance artifacts is critical, but 3 questions are pretty self-evident and easily met by most companies. We haven't had someone fall down on this topic and say, I'm not sure how to do this. How heavy should I go? Well, I should say we haven't had someone fall down on this yet. Understanding open source community engagement. This is something which we've had, I wouldn't say a messaging problem, I'd say a messaging challenge. OpenChain is non-prescriptive about contribution. It's non-prescriptive about community engagement. And OpenChain is very clearly allowing people and encouraging people to choose the appropriate path for themselves. What is important is that people actually have a contribution policy. Because if they don't lock that in, something will go wrong at some point. So do you have a policy that governs contributions to open source projects on behalf of the organization? And sometimes when people read that, they feel like they should contribute. That's not what they should be reading. A valid policy is we never contribute. That's perfectly valid. As long as people know what they're doing and they can tell their staff what they're doing, that's fine. I raise this point because the question itself for our community appears clear, but we do sometimes get people saying, are you saying I have to contribute? And I'm not quite sure how we address that. I guess we just keep reiterating it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems reasonable to consider that there might be some further ideas for people to think about in some of the onboarding materials, because there is a full spectrum of ways you can participate. You can participate in bug reports only. You can participate in blogs only. You can contribute in whole files, but no snippets, all sorts of things. And those are good for your company to decide so that you can train your people accordingly.
That's an excellent point. Because sometimes companies appear to contribute to documentation or setup information without contributing code, by way of example.
Sure.
Yeah, Shane, in the open source, the template open source policy, there are some options there, different ways in which participation can take place.
So I suppose, one thing that's quite clear is probably we should steer people heavily towards the open source policy, because when they look at the various components and options, that might help frame their thinking. Adjacent to the reference training slides, which also makes it pretty clear what your staff need to know. All righty.
Sorry, Shane, just one other thing. We do make a distinction between where you're contributing to a project outside of ARM versus a project that is an ARM open source project, because some of the governance requirements are obviously different, whether it's something that you control or it's another organization or project that controls those contributions. So in our processes and policies, we make that distinction because we require our engineers, for example, if they're creating an ARM project, that they have to think about the long-term governance and how they're going to manage contributions coming from outside, and what sort of additional setup in terms of the process they need to, and where are they going to host the project, etc.
That's a really good point. We probably need to look at the idea of doing perhaps case studies on these individual topics with companies, just to allow people, even a really short one, a paragraph or two, to give companies a chance to talk out on this. Now, some of the people on the call are part of the to-do group, and to-do group does have some of this material at hand with the guides, where we have, in general, how to do open source program office stuff, but we also have open source program office case studies from a lot of major companies here. So some of them are OpenChain board members like Comcast, Facebook, Microsoft, and Uber. And I think these case studies are pretty useful at triaging the overview. Maybe we should try to link more explicitly into more to-do group material. We do reference it, but maybe we can try to link people directly into it. All right, so the first one is about policy. The next one is a documented procedure. And this is to make sure that, make sure the policy is made real. So we have had occasions where companies have a policy, but it's not clear how it's going to be implemented. And for that reason, it isn't. And at the same time, sometimes companies have a policy which might lead to an interesting contribution procedure in fact, as opposed to a formal contribution procedure. I recall one very major multinational, which is now a very different legal structure, that actually didn't allow their staff to contribute to open source projects using the company email. And in certain contracts with certain staff members, those staff members had carved out their community contribution as opposed to corporate contribution in their contract, which led to an interesting situation where you might find the person's name, non-corporate email, and be unsure, are you dealing with corporate code or individual code? Which is obviously not really a great thing when it comes to managing your corporate open source contributions and knowing what your obligations are. That was just a side note. Do you have a documented procedure that makes all the staff available of the existence of the policy? Yeah, this is, again, is a no-brainer, but it is something that is a process failing point. But it is also a question that's easy to answer. We're back to the procedure could be emailing them, and that's fine. These items where we require notifications or similar are probably the items where companies ask the most questions about process fidelity. And when they come to us and they talk about the fidelity proposed, they're often overshooting. They're talking about making entire portals that the staff have to review for policy training and all the procedures, which may be a little bit too heavy if you're not a significantly big company with resources to do so. So we have to probably do a little bit of a better job at explaining that people can fill that procedure out with a process that's appropriate to their size and market. That's because, again, people tend to overshoot. They tend to go as good as possible, which is great. But at the same time, people need to spin up a great compliance program as opposed to go from 0 to great in one step. And now we're wrapping up goal 6. Goal 6 is all about making sure things don't go off the rails. So first of all, the documentation confirming that your program meets all the requirements of this specification. So that documentation is very important in the supply chain, because this is how the customers will regulate OpenChain in practice in different markets with different levels of fidelity. Your customer company asks you for the documentation confirming that your program meets the requirements. And your customer companies can dig in to the various aspects of this conformance where you have a documented procedure. So they can kick the tires on, for example, your documented procedure for informing all your staff on contribution. And they can have a look at that and tell you whether they think it meets their expectations or not. So this particular question is actually the key leverage point to use economics to make sure self-certification in each sector with each company size is appropriate for their usage situation. And we have found that to be a very simple, elegant, and useful way to do this. Second of all, documentation confirming that your program conformance was reviewed in the last 18 months. This is simply because sometimes companies do it, and 5 years later, the people have moved on, the processes have changed and broken, et cetera, et cetera. So really goal 6 is about making sure that everyone is fresh and everyone can explain how they did this. These questions, I think, have no ambiguity at all. I don't see any problems with them. For adoption, we've never had a question about them with any level of confusion. All right, to recap, people tend to worry about things like communicating with their staff. That tends to be a slight failing point where people overshoot how to do it. And that came up in goal 1, and it came up in goal 5 by way of examples. That's where I think I might need to fix our guidance material. We don't need to fix the questions, but we need to fix how people understand the questions. I just wanted to pause here and see if people had any comments or questions about where we've got to today in going through the questionnaire.
Shane, how would you like to receive any offline comments on today?
Oh, okay. Email would be great. I mean, the best way to do it would be to actually comment on the lists. So I'm just going to pull up our groups.io list. So, I mean, the best way we could do this would to literally be on the OpenChain main list. So that page is open right now. I'm also going to copy paste it into the chat. You can send me an email privately. That's totally fine. But it would be fantastic to have it on the list to also enable other people to comment and contribute. We do find that if it is a public comment, it's very useful for inspiring others. And particularly because it disseminates across the global community. I mean, don't forget, we've got work groups, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, India, Germany, UK. And, you know, it takes a while to spin out across these groups. And if it goes to the main mailing list, it definitely will over time. But emailing me directly is fine. And I'm putting my email address in the browser bar. I'm also going to put it in the chat. And you can email me directly with anything at any time.
Hey, Shane, this is Gary. Did you want to give a brief overview of the repository that stores the OpenChain questionnaire in case anybody wants to raise issues or pull requests directly?
Absolutely. Let's go find it. Conformance questionnaire. There we go. So as with everything, it's totally open. Gary, would you like to just talk to it for a minute and let people know about it?
Sure. First, an apology. It is in a somewhat technical format. They're JSON files, and that's necessary because in addition to the text, we need to capture, you know, what are the correct answers. This is what actually feeds that questionnaire application that Shane was using just a few minutes ago. Everything should be well documented now. If it's not, please open an issue or a pull request. This is an open GitHub repository, so anybody can access it. If you want, just pull up the questionnaire en.json,
Okay.
just to give everybody kind of a quick, you just click on go to the left and just click on the file name there.
I'm just going to pull it up, but first I've got a question. Why is one just questionnaire JSON?
Yeah, so that's the default, which is just a copy of the English version. So anybody who wants to contribute translations, we have 3 translations in there already.
Right.
But this just gives you kind of an idea of what the kind of the structure of that is. So, you know, if you see a spelling error or you want to propose a wording change, you can find it in here and just you know, contribute a pull request and make that suggestion, and then it's easy for us to track, you know, the actual changes. Once we agree to make the change, it gets merged into the repository and it automatically generates a PDF document, and then we have to go into the application to pull the latest version of this particular repo in to update the application. But it's a pretty straightforward process. If anybody has any questions, let me know. Yeah. Go ahead,
I'll
Shane.
literally show it here while the questions come in. I'm going to fix question 2E, editing in the background, so people can just see how to do it. Someone was going to speak, I think.
Shane, I have a question.
Fire, yeah.
Okay, so going back, it's not on the Jason. Going back to section 1, there's a question here. It says, you documented evidence of assessed competence for each program participant. So this question throws me for a loop on 2 points. First of all, each program participant. So I mean, you can consider every software engineer to some degree as a program participant.
Right.
Is that what we're really trying to address?
No, we're not. And
Okay.
here's where we may want to change the questionnaire a little bit. So the spec essentially talks about the appropriate personnel. So we may need to narrow this down on the spec questions to make clear that it's the appropriate personnel as opposed to a blanket coverage. It's a really good point.
Okay, good. And then what would you think of as documented evidence of assessed competence?
Yeah, I mean, and you know, people like Sammy have been here from the beginning and can also talk to this, but my basic feeling is that it's making sure that the people are trained and they know the procedures. So, you know, evidence that they are trained, they understand what's happening, and they're aware of this particular responsibility they've got.
So
Okay,
absolutely,
so
Shane. I mean, so Mary, we took a very, very conservative approach and decided that we will train all our 5,000 engineers and those who are involved in any form of having interaction with open source. And we actually roll out that training and require them to, it's a compulsory training. They have to complete it. They have to answer some questions to make sure that they have understood what is required. But I would say probably knowing others who've gone through the conformance, we just took a very literal interpretation, particularly that we're an IP company and we felt that actually that level of education is necessary anyway for those employees.
Okay, and did that training, I mean, what level did that training go to?
It's an online training that has 4 modules based on what we contributed to the OpenChain training, from the basics of IP law to having sort of more detailed sort of license, open source license training and processes. So it's 4 modules. We chose to split them into 4 modules as this was easier to roll out. But the key thing that we did there was it's online training where we know which employees have completed the training and which employees haven't. So we can actually go and mandate that they complete that training. And it also is any new joiners automatically are assigned the training and must complete that training within 45 days.
Okay, we're putting a program together at the moment, and the way that we're doing this is we are using the curriculum as a template for this. But the curriculum, if you look at the slides, is a very large number of them. So we're modularizing it. And then if you look in the standard policy template, you'll see that there's a grid in there, which basically breaks down against each of the individual roles. It breaks down each of the individual training that they need to undertake, because obviously, you know, if they're a developer, they need to take a certain amount of training, but you could say that somebody who's involved in providing marketing services in relation to open source code is also a program participant. They don't need to know about details of the tool chain, for example. That's the sort of structure that we've taken for developing the training. Then as far as the assessment is concerned, then against each of the items, there's a sort of check your knowledge section. And so we just put a very lightweight multiple choice questionnaire together based on that, so that check your understanding, this bit here, yeah, exactly. so that people can then basically answer a multiple choice question, and that will assess whether they have understood that particular module or not.
And if I recall correctly, the most verbose section of this slide deck is now actually the final 2 chapters. So tooling use cases and tooling types. The primary original section was 1 to 8, and I think that fits in about 80 slides. I'm just gonna pull it up to chapter 8 and just double check that. Yeah. So you go all the way through from what is intellectual property through to developer guidelines in 82 slides. And it's 8 chapters, and of each chapter has a check your understanding. And you can take the check your understandings from those 8 points and make it into your open source exam, which does a full check of competency.
Okay.
By the way, these slides are CC0, and they're available in editable formats. So companies can take anything they want out of this. There's no attribution, nothing, so they can just use it freely. Alrighty, we are running out of time. We're 2 minutes over the hour. The thing I will do just to end us is, and if I can find my page, yeah. I am going to finish editing the conformance questionnaire just to show you how it works. So question 2E had a typo. Have you identified program roles properly staffed and has adequate funding? Full stop, question mark. So I'm just going to fix that, get rid of that full stop. I'll say fix the typo in 2E. Commit directly to master branch, and that's it. Now it's there with Gary and so on, so they can deal with in the future. Gary went off the call, he ran out of time. But the short version is, while JSON can look a little bit intimidating, the text is all text, and you can edit it on GitHub just by clicking the pencil and typing the change. And if something goes horribly wrong, we can revert at any time. That's just a side note. Everyone, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. That was a really useful talk. And I'm going to take all of this feedback and make everything clearer, easier, and more beautiful for the next time. We're going to have a full video for our community to run through this as a guide in August.
Very exciting, Shane.
Fantastic.
Thank you,
Thanks
Shane.
so much.
Thank
Okay,
you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.